Hi there, and welcome at this session about how to implement a design in OutSystems. I hope you are as exciting as I am for this next step and OSDC conference that we all are attending. Unfortunately, we are not able to do it on site and be together, but this is still a very good alternative and a way for me to interact with all of you. In terms of interaction, we have set up a Slido account, so you already should see the QR code on the screen. So please grab your phone or another device, or maybe on the same device, scan the QR code, or you can go to slido.com and log in with the hashtag OSDC. We'll be having some polls in the beginning, just for me to get to know you, to see who you are. And at the end, there's also going to be a survey. All right, so let's get started. Let me first introduce myself. So while you are all also signing in to Slido and answering the two questions I've prepared there, I take some time to introduce myself. So my name is Kilian Croese, which you already should know. I'm the current CTO of Team Resilience, a Netherlands-based OutSystems partner, and also one of the co-founders of Studio Doppelganger, which is a UX studio completely focused on creating designs for low-code platforms. Recently, I've also been elected as an OutSystems MVP. In terms of study and career, I studied computer science in Delft University, got a bachelor's degree, and did an executive master's in enterprise IT architecture in Antwerp. Been married for about 9 years now, 9.5 I think, and the father of a 4-year-old son. And then before working at Team Resilience, I worked at Conclusion low-code company and at Capgemini, where basically all my career I worked with low-code platforms. All right, so enough about me. Let's learn a little bit more about you guys. So just seeing at who you are, I see at least 20 people in our session, so welcome all. I see a very big group with, people that are here for about 1 or 2 years. So the majority of you are relatively new to OutSystems. So that's good to know. I think actually almost 3/4 is 2 years or less. So that's good for me to know. And let's have a look at where you're all from. So a big part of you is from the Netherlands. I see people from Portugal, even United States, Romania. Well, welcome all. It's glad to have you in this stream. All right, so I still see people coming in, so that's very good. Also at the start, a little bit of promotion. I will be doing more sessions during OSDC. So in the afternoon, together with Vicky Makes, I will also be hosting a session about circuit breakers. Tomorrow, at the start of OSDC, I have another session about security, titled Hacking the Team Resilience Bank, where I'm going to show you how to create secure applications and what you should be aware of. Then there's an awesome session by Sumaya, my colleague, about complex UIs. She's done a lot of work for one of her customers integrating with ArcGIS, a geographical platform. You can compare it to Google Maps, where we basically created an Airbnb-style interface for one of our customers. And at the end of OSDC, there's a session by 3 of my colleagues, Flavio, Marjolein, and Leon, primarily focused to junior developers. They are going to talk about ways to annoy your tech lead, but also, of course, they're going to tell you how to avoid those mistakes that they made in the beginning of their career. All right, so the agenda for today. I will do a brief introduction, then we cover some theory. So I'll be talking a little bit about CSS and the fundamentals and the most important concepts of CSS, because that's the foundation of everything you do with design. Then we talk a little bit more, we move over from the generic theory to how do we apply that in an OutSystems world. And then at the end of the presentation, I'll be covering the 5 steps I defined to go from a design to a working OutSystems team. All right, so let's get started. So imagine you work at this company, the Resilience Bank, and they decided that they should create a mobile banking application. And the designers have already proceeded, so they created all kinds of really good-looking designs. And you are the developer of this Resilience Bank, and you get an email like, hey, developers, this is what it should be like. Go ahead, now do your job and start implementing all of the application we designed. So then the question becomes, like, how do you proceed? So you have a bunch of images and designs, and you need to make it work in an OutSystems environment. So hopefully for you, the designers have worked in a tool like Sketch or Figma, which is the tool we use internally here as well. So you can already also click on the designs and be able to see the generated CSS. So it's really tempting to say, hey, let's have a look at this title at the top, and then look at the CSS, which you can see in the right bottom of the screen, and just start at copy-pasting the CSS to OutSystems, which is something I have seen a lot of junior developers do. So they start implementing and importing a whole lot of CSS all over the place, which of course there is a better way. So this is kind of the background and the context what I'll be talking about, but let's first take a step back basically and zoom in a little bit about, let's talk about the technology that we use to define our themes and style sheets, which is CSS. CSS is a style sheet language used to describe the presentation of a document, primarily written in HTML or XML. So HTML and XML, they define the markup, so, hence the name markup language, so the structure of the information. And with CSS, you can add a layer on top of that in how you present that information. So in CSS, as you can see on the right, you define selectors with a declaration. And so there's properties and properties values. So this example, there's a paragraph, a bunch of text usually, and you can define the color property, and in this case you set it to red. There's a whole lot of different CSS properties that you can use. I'm not going to cover all of those because that's way beyond the extent of this presentation. But I think it's good to kind of have a common understanding of what CSS is and how we define the CSS rules. So let's go and look into three of the most fundamental and most important concepts of CSS. First, we'll be talking about the cascade. Second, we'll be looking into specificity. And third, inheritance. And also, as I said during the introduction, we'll be looking into those topics and how they will be implemented and used in an OutSystems environment. So first, the cascade. What really matters in CSS is the order of the CSS rules. So when two rules apply and they have equal specificity, the one that's defined last is the one that wins, so to say. So you can have a look at this example to the right, which I happen to borrow from the Mozilla documentation. You see an H1 element with two rules, I think a red one and a blue one. And the blue one, that's the one that's defined last. So because of the cascade, it's the one that's defined last, and it's the one that is actually being applied by the browser. And this is an important concept, and it's also heavily being used in OutSystems and the OutSystems platform, but we'll get back to that later on. Then the second subject, specificity. It's a very tough word, I have to say. I practiced a lot to be able to pronounce it correctly. And it's actually a topic that's quite often misunderstood or not well known. So let's take some time to really look into that. And specificity is all about how you can have multiple selectors that apply to a single element, and then the browser needs to figure out which one of those selectors is actually the one that it should be applying. So basically what they have done in CSS is that you can kind of consider it as a point system, which you can also see in this specificity sheet on the right. So let's spend some time and have a look at the first box and the left top corner, which is the asterisk, so the selector for any kind of element, which it doesn't have any value. So you see 3 zeros at the bottom, 0, 0, 0. So you can define an asterisk, and it will basically never win. Then the next one is element selectors. So you see, I think it's a plankton. It gets a value of 0, 0, 1. Of course, you can combine those. So if you can add multiple elements. So you see the list item and the unordered list next to each other. And then you have two element selectors, which will get a value of 2 times 1 is 2. Of course, this can be done multiple times. You can get a whole swarm of plankton, which I think in the example are like 12 of them. So those are the HTML elements, the lowest of value. Then we move on to the CSS selectors, so the classes, sorry. They get 10 points, so you see 0, 1, 0. And those as well can be combined with the asterisks or with the HTML elements. And as you can see, for example, a combination of one HTML element and a class will get a value of 1 and 1. Then let's speed up a little. So we have the HTML elements, the classes, and then there's a couple of other ones. So you can have inline styles, selectors there, which are pretty much always selected. And the last one is the important statement, which it's displayed as a nuclear bomb. They really should be a last resort. They also might have a performance impact on the rendering of the page, because what happens when the browser starts rendering the whole page, it encounters an important statement, and then it needs to basically start re-rendering everything it has rendered before. So you can imagine if there's multiple important statements, you're getting into a loop rendering the page. I just saw that I didn't cover the IDs, so you can also use IDs and the value of IDs as selectors, which have a higher value than the classes, but you should also be careful using IDs, because you can only have one unique ID on your page, so you shouldn't be using them all too often. All right, so an example regarding specificity. So we see we have a main header class and I think it's a header 1 element defined. And actually the class will win because the classes have a higher value than the HTML elements. Then inheritance. So some CSS elements will also inherit from others. And I think the example shows it really well. So we define a body selector. So say, well, everything in the body will be blue. And then the next selector is, well, except for a span. A span should be black. So if you look closely at the HTML at the bottom, you see 2 paragraphs. So the paragraphs themselves, they inherit the blue color from the body, except for the span, which is rendered to be black. All right, so that's a high overview of the theory and CSS. There's much more to say about it, and I think I can highly recommend some of the tools at the Mozilla documentation. They have very well resources to learn and to expand your knowledge of CSS. So let's move over to OutSystems. And in OutSystems, we define this whole look and feel in themes. And themes can be based on another theme, and by default you use the OutSystems UI theme. And kind of by basing a theme on another, you see already the cascade coming in, because there's a different order in which those style sheets are actually loaded. So what OutSystems does, and it's called the style sheet precedence, it first loads in your page the CSS style sheets for your blocks. And blocks, as we know, they should be generic components. The styling that are defined in the blocks, they shouldn't really matter. They should be easily overwritten by your themes, which is exactly the case. So the next up is the themes, and also in the themes, they load it in the order of a theme based on another theme, based on another theme, etc. So in this example, we are using OutSystems UI, and we've built our own bank theme on top of OutSystems UI. So it overrides the styles defined in OutSystems UI. So as you can see, it first loads OutSystems UI, then the bank theme. Then there's another style sheet. So if you define CSS on your screens directly, the platform will also load those style sheets as the last. And also if you switch screens, for example, it will unload and load the style sheet that belongs to that specific page. Then there's one more. It's not really a style sheet, but of course if you define inline CSS, it will also be applied because of the specificity that we just talked about. All right. Talking about a little bit of architecture. So if we look at OutSystems UI, and I'm focusing here on the reactive part, OutSystems UI comes with a lot of patterns, so all the components or widgets, and with a default theme that defines the look and feel of all those components. And also there's a template, so the default screen templates that are also part of OutSystems UI. So what we're going to do, so one of the things you can do, which I would highly recommend, is install the live style guide preview component. And that actually is a living documentation of the look and feel of, in this case, OutSystems UI. And if you see what we do in this presentation and for application, is that we have created our own theme, the bank theme, which inherits or is based on the OutSystems UI theme. And we cloned the live style guide preview into one that is actually consuming our bank theme and not OutSystems UI. and our bank application is also consuming that same theme. So that's a way for you to actually have this living documentation of the theme you defined yourself. So you can have a look at what's available, how it will look like, the specific classes and the impact. So that's also something I would highly recommend. All right, so let's have a look at the process I talked about. So as we said in the start, it is very tempting to start going into the nitty-gritty details and look at this heading and all the CSS that's applied. But actually, we should be taking a step back. So if you have a big picture of all the screens that you should be developing, take a step back, zoom out a little, so to say, and try to look at the structure of these pages. So what do I see? So in this example, for example, if we look at the three screens that I shared here, they clearly have a header identified. So we have a header with a title and some icons. Then there's a content area. So in the middle of the page, there's content that the content itself differs a lot. But the bottom area in the footer where you see the menu is the same for all three of these screens. So actually the middle one, you don't see it on the screenshot, but believe me, the bottom bar is there at the bottom. So try to really look at the structure of these pages and see if you have already available layouts. Conveniently enough for me, the designs were made with OutSystems in mind by our friends from Studio Doppelganger. And they know that the default layout of OutSystems has a header, a content area, and a footer. But if you encounter pages or screens that don't follow this layout pattern, I would advise you to start creating those layouts yourselves. And if you do that in OutSystems, so in Server Studio, you would end up like something that you see in the right-hand side, which is the skeleton or the basic structure of those pages. All right, so next step. So we've defined the layout, the structure. Now let's start looking at components or design patterns. So in order to be able to identify those, you need to be familiar with what OutSystems UI provides out of the box. So I would really encourage all of you, go to outsystemsui.com, have a look at all those components and really embrace yourself with the information that's there. Maybe if you're working in a large organization where you have a lifestyle guide of your own organization, have a look at that and become really familiar with the components that are there. So then the exercise in step 2 is to really try to map everything you see on the screen to one of those components. So let's have a look at this example and start at the top. So at the top I see two icons, left and right. I see some text, which is a title. Then I know that there's a component called the list item content, which defines an area on the left, a title and a description in the middle, and an area on the right. And in this case we're using it with an icon, I think the name of the type of the account or the name of the account, some account numbers, and on the right is the actual balance. Then next up is something that looks like a tag. We have a transfer button, which is a floating content button. And last up are bottom bar items. So in this case, we have been able to map all the components that you see on the screen to available components in OutSystems UI. But if it happens to be the case that you encounter something that isn't directly available, you should be creating those components yourself. And if you do that, you see already that our application starts to get into shape. It's not, it doesn't look like yet what we're aiming for, but at least the structure, the skeleton has some flesh on its bones now. So we already see the title, the values, and things happening. So that's it for step 2. Then the third step is that the way OutSystems UI is built is that actually they start with defining a whole lot of CSS variables. These variables define a lot of things like the typography, so how big, how many pixels is your heading 1 or your heading 2 or 3, etc. Which colors do we use, so what's the primary color, what's the secondary color, but also spacing. So if, for example, imagine you have a form and there's spacing between all the input items, and you want to unify that. So there's margins and paddings that you can use with default value like a margin base. And all of those things and all those values are defined by CSS variables. And as a first step, I would propose to have a look at those variables and redefine them. So in your own theme that overrides OutSystems UI, define if there's any differences, those values. So for example, it is towards the bottom of the images that are on the screen. Our primary color that we use in our app and our secondary color is actually much different from what OutSystems UI uses. So by defining our own primary color, and because of the cascade that we talked about, our value has a higher value and will override the one defined by OutSystems UI. And actually by making these changes by the CSS variables, you can see that the application actually already starts to get more and more into shape where we want it to be. So you can see that that we're making big steps towards where we need to go. Then as a fourth step, and the fourth step and the fifth they sometimes can or should be combined, but I will cover that later. But let's look at it first from a perspective of being the first step. So as part of OutSystems UI, there's also a whole lot of classes defined that you can use. So for example, I just talked about those margin and padding classes, but also classes to make text a certain heading or give them a color or a background color, border radiuses, shadows. Well, there's a whole lot of things available. So also, I think there's two resources that I can highly recommend. I actually happened to just learn about the cheat sheet. I think for those of you who have been here for a long time, back in the day of Silk UI, there was also a cheat sheet available. It has been part of the live style guides as well. But if you go to outsystemsui.com and go to the resources section, you can have a look at the live style guide from OutSystems itself, but also at the cheat sheet. And by looking through that cheat sheet, really familiarize yourself with all the available classes that are there to help you in your front-end development. So yeah, let's have a look at our example, and I'm going to highlight a very tiny one. So let's have a look at this transfer button. So what I'm looking here at is the design, so the goal that we are trying to design. In Server Studio, it looks like this. So it's there in the bottom. It's a bit hidden. Well, but if we zoom it out, it's a button. It has an icon, some text, and it has two classes: the button and the button primary. And because of the primary class, it gets this green background. But we want our button to have rounded corners. So there's a convenient class available in this case, the border radius rounded class, and we can simply apply this to our button to give it this rounded corners. Let's go to the fifth step, and then I'll go back, because there's the fourth and the fifth step you have to be careful while executing. So the last one is, well, once you've done all these four steps, there's not much more that you can do than really start overriding the individual styles of the components that OutSystems UI provides. So on the screen, I've shared an example of the bottom bar, where I said, well, everything I do in the bottom bar should have these certain colors, where you define basically default values. So while executing step 4 and 5, you should be really thinking of, like, hey, for example, this button, should all of my buttons have rounded corners? In that case, it makes most sense to override the default styling of a button in your own theme. But if you say, well, all of my buttons, some of them will have rounded corners and some of them don't, then use step 4 and apply the available classes. So that's why I said with step 4 and 5, they kind of go hand in hand. So if you go all out on step 4 and put all these classes on your screens, you might be doing it wrong. Because you really should be looking at and thinking of, hey, is this the default behavior that I'm wanting, that I want or that I envision for this component? Then it should be in the style sheet for that component. Or are these like differences? So for example, I think the margins and the paddings ones are classes that you most often are safe to use. But if you start looking into changing colors, background colors, typographies, then you probably should be looking at, hey, what's the default look and feel of this component, and should I be overriding that? So those are the 5 steps. Look at the structure. The second one, look at the components. Then look at the CSS variables. Add the CSS classes that are available. And last, start customizing all the components. Then I thought it was really interesting while also preparing for this presentation and doing this exercise. Sometimes you hear people say, like, hey, well, OutSystems isn't really fit to make nice looking applications, or it's really hard or tough, or it can't be done. So I thought it would be really fun to put a screenshot of the actual application that I developed and the design side by side. I don't know if you can see any differences. I'm very happy with how they look like, and I think they are really, really close to each other. I don't have a poll, could have done that to ask you which you think is the actual design. I will spoil it, so the right image is the design that I got from the designer, and the left one is a screenshot of the actual application and OutSystems that I built. So I think that just showcases the power and what you can do if you put also enough time and effort into it. Besides, I think some of the resources that I also already called out, if you work with designers, talk to them, become their friends, and start telling them and informing them about the fact that there's also some resources available. So there's a design kit for Figma and for Sketch, and if they can use that as the start of their design system, it will make your life to implement those designs actually a whole lot easier. That concludes the content of the presentation. So just a reminder, we're doing some more awesome presentations later today and tomorrow. So feel free to attend those. We'll be happy to have you there. Yeah, my contact information. So also if you're interested, if you have questions even after this session, feel free to add me on LinkedIn, for example. There's a QR code which you can scan, and then we can interact after the presentation. I'll give you one more second, and then let's start moving over towards the Q&A. I think there haven't been too many questions, so to say. So let me see. So the question from Gonzalo Ferreira, what are the main recommendations in terms of team architecture when designing an application? Let's see, let me see that I really understand the question. So I think that I briefly touched upon that as well. So I would also always advise to start with OutSystems UI. In theory, it's possible to define, to throw OutSystems UI out of the window, start from scratch. But it's a whole lot of work to get that done and to get that set up. So most organizations probably will not benefit from that. And then so take everything that OutSystems UI provides and build your own style sheet on top of that. And also only override the values that you want. So let's try to explain with an example. So let's go back to this button example. So OutSystems UI provides a default look and feel of a button. I think in OutSystems UI it will have a blue background color. It will have a little bit of soft, like a very slight border radius. Probably some white text. So you don't need to redefine all of those rules if you only want to change the background. So in your own theme, if you want to say, just like we did, we want this background to be green, you can say, well, yeah, you can do that by changing the CSS variables, but you can also say, well, our buttons will always have a certain green background color, and also use those CSS variables for that. All right, thanks, Anna. I will just wait a little bit more. I hope, Gonzalo, this answered your question. If you want to follow up or discuss, as I said, feel free to add me, to send me a message through LinkedIn or something. So I'll give you some more time. If there are any last remaining questions, well, I think we'll be rounding this presentation up then. So if you want, we've prepared a short post-session survey. So we'd be really happy to know, to see your responses, to see if, how you feel about the session, if it was useful or not. This will be open after the stream as well, so you don't have to do it straight away, but it would be really nice if you can. And then I think that will be concluding our session for today. So thanks for joining and enjoy the rest of OSDC.